Hello, this is my next installment in videos on what to read in world mythology. The last time I did Greek and Roman mythology. Today I'm going to talk about Norse mythology. The Norse mythology has to do with the regions of Norway, Sweden, Denmark. However, we also have to include Iceland when we talk about this area of mythology, because the Icelanders are the ones that, well, they're the ones that wrote everything down. We have them to thank for the books on Norse mythology. Also, it's important to remember that Norse mythology is part of a larger group of mythology known as Germanic or Teutonic mythology. So some of the books I'm going to talk about might touch on that a little bit. So to get started, like I did with my previous video, I'm going to mention a few books just to whet your appetite, give you an overall view by a particular author that retells all of the main stories, to kind of see if you're interested in the topic. The first book I'm going to talk about is a book I read many years ago, and it's a wonderful book, and the book is very old itself. I think it was written like 100 years ago. It's simply called The Norseman, and it's part of a series called Myths and Legends, and this particular book was written by H.A. Gerber. And if you want to talk about one single book that's got just about all the important myths of involving the gods and heroes of Norse myth, this is the book for you. The next book I'm going to include is a little more broad, but it's a little more recent. It's a Time Life book. Remember these books? They're really big. It's a Time Life book. It's part of a series called Myth and Mankind, and this one is called Sagas of the Norsemen, and it's subtitled Viking and German Myth. And the reason why this is really good is because, well, it's a beautiful book. It's illustrated. It's well written. It has history, geography, and not only does it include Norse mythology, but it talks about other areas as well. It talks about the story of Tannhauser. It talks about stories having to do with the Lombards, which were a Germanic tribe that invaded northern Italy. And it talks about lesser-known Germanic myths as opposed to just the Norse myths. So this is a really great book. And one more book I want to mention. It's this book by Kevin. You've probably seen this book around. It's part of the Pantheon Fairy Tale and Folklore Library, and it's called The Norse Myths by Kevin Crossley Holland. This book is also a retelling of all the important Norse myths. However, he doesn't include any heroes and heroines. And I really like this book, not so much for his version of the stories, but I like his introduction. And I really like his introduction. I like his notes. They're very informative. Okay, so now those are three books to start with. Now let's look at the actual literature. There's two main source books of Norse mythology that you have to read to know about. Unlike the Greek myths, where there's a lot of source material, and there's quite a bit of source material too for Norse myth, but there's two books that are at the top of the list. One is called the Prose Edda, and it's by a medieval Icelander by the name of Snorri Sturluson. And the reason why it's called the Prose Edda, he called it simply Edda, which means something like poetry or poetics, but modern scholars, they give it the title of Prose Edda to distinguish it from the next book I'm going to talk about, the Prose Edda, because it's mostly written in prose. He wrote it in prose, but it's a book on how to write poetry, because he didn't want poetry to die out. So why is it in this list? Because what he uses as his source material to write poems about, he uses the old myths that were still probably circulating in his time, although he lived during Christian times, but these stories were probably still circulating all around, and he put a lot of them in this book. And this particular translation is by Jean I. Young. It's an old translation. I think it's very, very good. The only problem with this translation is that it's not 100% complete, but she includes all the important stuff. But if you insist on reading a full translation, there's this one here, which is also very good. It's by Anthony Fawkes, and it's put out by Everyman Library, and you could see Snorri Sturluson's title there. And and the translator uses the original title, which is simply Edda, but it's the Prose Edda. The other important book is to read after the Prose Edda is, you guessed it, Poetic Adam. And the reason why this is called Poetic Adam is because it's mostly written in poetry form. It's written in verse. So this is unlike the earlier book, which was written by Snorri Sturluson, who lived in the 13th century. He was very interesting. I know I'm backtracking here, but I just wanted to mention that he was a chieftain, a law speaker, and a writer. But unlike the Prose Edda, this book was the poems were written by a series of anonymous authors, but they were all put together in medieval Iceland, and we have them today as the Poetic Adam. And they include both stories of the gods and heroes, and the translator is Lee M. Hollander, and it's put out by University of Texas Press. This is a very beautiful edition, but the only problem is that it's a little hard to read. A lot of his translations are a little, I don't know, highfalutin, a little complicated to read. If you want to read another translation, there's this one, which is very good. It's broken into 2 volumes. It's also called the Poetic Edda, but one volume is the heroic. One volume is the mythological poems, and the second is the heroic poems. And the translation is by Henry Adams Bellows. It's an old translation. A lot of people still think it's the best, and I think it's very good. But if you want a very up-to-date, scholarly, one volume, affordable translation of the Poetic Edda, you could use this one. It's put out by World's Classics, and it's translated by Caroline Larrington. And some people don't like it. I don't have a problem with it. I think it reads well. It's it's a lot of fun, and so those are the 2 main source books. There's another book written by a Danish writer, a medieval Danish writer, which usually doesn't get talked about in books on Norse mythology. It doesn't get as much love as the Eddas, and that's this book, The History of the Danes. He wrote in Latin, unlike the other authors that wrote in Scandinavian languages. He wrote in Latin. The original title of this book, which is The History of the Danes, is Gesta Danorum, which is Latin for The History of the Danes. And his name is Saxo Grammaticus. And the book is really long, but this particular volume is only 1 through 9, and it contains a lot of great, interesting legends and myths that are very different from what you usually read when you read about the Norse gods and heroes. It's a very different take on those stories, and it's definitely worth reading. This one is by Peter Fisher. The translator is Peter Fisher. If you don't want to spend this wasn't cheap. If you don't want to spend money on it, and there's public domain versions that don't cost anything. I read one years ago that didn't cost me anything. I downloaded it on iBooks. So. I mentioned Snorri Sturluson before when I mentioned the Prose Edda. I think I should also mention that he wrote another very long book called The History of the Norwegian Kings, and I don't have a physical copy with me. It's mostly quasi-historical tales about the rulership of all the major kings that ruled in Norway. However, they don't really have anything to do directly with mythology as much. However, the very first story I think you should read, let me see if I can find it here. I did download a version for, here it goes. Yeah, Snorri Sturluson. The Icelandic name is Heimskringla, but it translates into The Lives of the Norse Kings, and it's a very long book. But I think for the purpose of this video, it's good to read the very first saga. Because he goes back to the remote past, and he talks about Odin and Freya, and he talks about the war between the Æsir and the Vanir, which is not really talked about much in the Eddas. So at the very least, I think it's important to read the very first story. The very first saga is called the Saga of the Inglings, or Ynglinga Saga. If you can't remember the name, just remember it's the very first saga. So I just think it's important. I read it. I didn't read. I read it, and I read one other saga in this book, but I didn't read much else. Now I mentioned the word saga. Saga is just a story that the Icelanders use to refer to their stories. There's all different types. Most of them are, well, I don't know if most of them, but a lot of them have to do with family sagas. They're kind of like quasi-historical tales of people who settled in Iceland from when the Vikings first went there. And they're kind of the equivalent of, I guess, today's historical novel, so to speak, because they're kind of semi-legendary. However, I believe they're mostly based on real people. But some of these sagas are actually more legendary. They're more mythological. They tell of heroes, and I'm going to mention three of them that I think you absolutely must read for this video. The first one is the Saga of the Volsungs. It's not necessarily the best saga, but it's the biggest story to come, the biggest hero story to come out of Scandinavia, out of the Viking world. It's kind of like William Morris, the great English writer and artist, called it the Iliad of the North. It's basically the most pervasive, the most talked about. I'm choking on my words here. We have Wagner, who partly based his operas, The Ring of the Nibelungs, on this story. It tells the story of Sigurd and the Dragon Slayer. He kills a dragon, and this particular volume is kind of old. However, there are other volumes out there that you could probably download. There's probably public domain versions that don't cost anything. This particular old version I have here is an old translation by Anderson, and this is a wonderful story. The next one I'm going to mention is you're going to laugh when you see this because you're going to recognize the name. Any fans out there of the show Vikings? Well, it's the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok. There's a reason the character is called Ragnar Lothbrok in the series, because he actually has his own saga. This is a great, another wonderful saga, and Ragnar Lothbrok, kind of like the hero of the Saga of the Volsungs, he kills a dragon, saves somebody from a tower, and then it goes on to what his sons did after he's murdered, and I have it. The version I have is housed in this old used book. However, I looked online. There's public domain versions. Just type in the Saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, and you'll find versions out there. You don't have to look for this one. And finally, there's one more legendary saga I want to mention, and that's this one, which is also a great saga. It's called the King Rolf and his champions. An alternate translation, an alternate title is the Saga of Rolf Kraki, Kraki. This is another wonderful saga, legendary saga, and it's housed in a larger book I have here called Eric the Red and Other Icelandic Sagas. The translator is Jones, and it's put out by It's put out by World's Classics. This is a great book because not only does it have the saga of King Rolf and his champions, it also has other Icelandic sagas, and a lot of these sagas are the family sagas about people who they're less mythological, less heroic, less legendary. You may not be interested in them, but they're definitely worth reading. But this particular book has the saga of King Rolf, which is the main one I'm talking about. And if you're not interested in this book, in the other sagas, again, online you could type in King Rolf and his champions, and there's all free versions of it. You could download on Kindle or iBooks, probably Nook if you have it. And yes, there's a dragon that dies, and so I recommend that. Moving out of the Icelandic Scandinavian world and moving south into Germany, or Austria, I should say, is this other book that I think is absolutely essential. It's the Nibelungenlied. Nibelungenlied means, it's translated as the Song of the Nibelungs. The Nibelungs are a tribe of people that this book talks about. Again, if Nibelung sounds familiar, it's because Wagner took it for his Ring of the Nibelungs. It's one of the source materials of the operas, and again, it's part of that complex of legends involving Siegfried, the Dragon Slayer. This is more the Austrian version, but don't feel that just because you read the Saga of the Volsungs, you could skip this one. This is a totally different book. It's very differently written. The details are very different. The Icelandic sagas, they're all written mostly, well, they have poetry in them, but they're mostly written in prose. This is all poetry. It's an amazing story. This one is a classic translation put out by Penguin. The translator is Hatto, Hatto, and again it tells another version of Siegfried the Dragon Slayer. And another book that I'm going to mention that again doesn't get as much love as the Song of the Nibelungs, and that's this beautiful little book called Gudrun. And it's another medieval epic from the German world. This particular version is put out by Everyman Classics, and the translator is Brian O. Murdoch. I don't know if this is still available. I read this version. It's a prose translation, but I also read a verse translation that I downloaded free on Kindle. If you can't find this one, however, be aware that in this translation he uses a K. In other translations, use a G. If this title doesn't come up, use a G, because in earlier translations they use Gudrun, not Kudrun. Another beautiful little book, but not as popular. Another book I'm going to mention is Beowulf. I think. I know this is a bit of a surprise. You've all had to suffer through this book in English literature classes. This particular version is put out by Mentor, and the translator is Burton Raffle. The reason why I mentioned Beowulf is because it's absolutely essential. I know it's English literature, but you got to remember, like the Great Britain. They had the Celts and the Romans there, but you got to remember that that it was also invaded by Germanic tribes, the Saxons, the Angles, the Jutes, and with them they brought their own versions of Germanic myth, Scandinavian myth. So it's and you got to remember, Old English itself is a subset of the Germanic languages. So this book deserves to be part of Norse mythology as any other book. As a matter of fact, the action doesn't take. It was written in England, in Northumbria, but it doesn't take place there. It actually takes place in both Sweden and Denmark, and it involves a dead dragon too, unfortunately. So I got to throw Beowulf in there. Okay. Now, we talked about general books. We talked about the actual literature. I want to mention two more books that have to do. Okay, you've read a lot of these books. Now you're interested in more in-depth meaning. You want to know an interpretation of these myths. What did they mean to the people? How did they derive? What does it have to do with faith and religion and culture? Well, there's anybody that knows anything about Norse mythology has heard of this author, H.R. Ellis Davidson. She's written a lot of books on Norse mythology, and she's written, any book you pick up by her is really good. This particular one is Scandinavian Mythology. And it's put out by a book series called Library of the World's Myths and Legends. They're great books, and in this book she talks a lot about the myths and their meanings. There's also another book by her. If you like this one, you can go ahead and read another book by her. This one's put out by Pelican, and it's called Gods and Myths of Northern Europe, and it's H.R. Ellis Davidson. This book is structured differently. In the very beginning, she very concisely and tightly tells you all the major Norse myths, very briefly in case you don't know them, and then she goes into analysis. But she doesn't talk too much about heroes in here. And she also wrote another book I read, which I don't have a physical copy. I downloaded. It's called The Road to Hell, which is about the afterlife in the mind of the ancient Icelanders and Scandinavians, which is also very interesting. So basically, that's an author you can go to. Now, there's one more book I'm going to mention as a bonus. You've all heard of this guy, J.R.R. Tolkien. You're all, probably familiar with The Lord of the Rings. Well, one thing you probably didn't know was Tolkien actually wrote his own version of the major legend of the Vikings, which was the story of the Volsungs, which tells the story of Sigurd, better known as Siegfried, Dragon Slayer, and he tells the story in two poems in this book. This book actually begins in the beginning of the video when I talked about retellings, but I wanted to throw it in at the end because it's a real extra bonus. Because if you love Tolkien and you love The Lord of the Rings and you're interested in other things he's written and you're interested in what his source was, because he was bowled over by Norse mythology. it's mainly what inspired his Lord of the Rings and his Hobbit. So this is a great little, in two poems that he writes, he tells the story of Sigurd, the Dragon Slayer. And the two poems are, instead of the Volsung saga, he has the two poems as Sigurd and Gudrun. Gudrun is the strong female character, and Sigurd is the Icelandic version of Siegfried, the Dragon Slayer. Okay, so like my Greek and Roman mythology video, I'm going to give you what's called the Hatchet List, or the Machete List, which is a watered-down list of books in case you're overwhelmed by all these books and you think it's too much to read. So here goes the Hatchet List. First book on the list is... Sorry about the mess. If you're interested in just Norse mythology and you're not interested in a very broad Germanic Norse myth, if you're interested in just Norse mythology, then read The Norseman by Gerber, the first book I talked about. Wonderful book. If you're interested in a more broad approach, then this book by Time Life, Sagas of the Norseman. Really great book. Then, after that, you got to read both Eddas. There's no escaping the Eddas. They're the two most important books in Norse mythology, and I'm going to really recommend the Prose Edda, the Gene I. Young version. The Gene I. Young version, the Prose Edda, and for the Poetic Edda, I'm going to recommend, you could read any of the previous ones I showed you, or if you want to read the complete version of the Prose Edda, you could read this other one I talked about. But I really like the Young version, and this version by Larrington of the Poetic Edda. So these books you have to include, because it's basically most of what we know about Norse mythology is housed in these two books. If you don't read these, I'm going to sick him after you. Okay, so after that, I think you should read at least one of the sagas I mentioned. At the very least, I think you should read the Saga of the Volsungs, because it's just the most important, pervasive saga that I think you should read out of all of them. The stuff that occurs in here occurs in the Poetic Edda. It's talked about in the Poetic Edda, in the Prose Edda. It's talked about in any general book you read on Norse mythology that includes the hero stories, and it's a great story. Another book that I think you absolutely must read, that's also part of that same corpus of legend that the Saga of the Volsungs is based on, is the Song of the Nibelungs. This is an absolute... Again, this is getting a little away from Norse myth and getting more into Austria, because this was written by an Austrian poet. But it's just such a magnificent book. And again, it tells the Austrian version of the whole story of Siegfried, the Dragon Slayer, and how he was stabbed in the back, and how revenge was taken by his wife. She's known as Kriemhild in this version. She's known as Gudrun in this version, and this story is just so prominent in the German mindset that I think it's even referred to in Django Unchained, the Quentin Tarantino film. I think is the one of the guys I think even mentions the story in this from this book. So I've included the two Eddas, the general reading book, the Saga of the Volsungs, the Nibelungenlieds. I think you absolutely, if you haven't read Beowulf, shame on you. You gotta read Beowulf. And I think one last book, at least one of these two books by Davidson. Either this one or this one. Either one is great. You can read both, but I think you should read at least one of them. And that's it. That's the Hatchet List. And so until next time, thanks for joining me, and happy reading.